Controllers are continually getting smaller in size, but some of them are actually increasing in the number of buttons they have. The question is, do you actually need all these buttons? Let's talk about the specific benefits of this controller and whether you actually need them. It's the steelbox from Sagaklabs. It is, of course, a leverless arcade controller, and as you can see, it has the standard layout, which has become very common on leverless controllers, which is left, right, down, and up for your main controls, and then you have light punch, medium punch, heavy punch, and your light kick, medium kick, heavy kick. By the way, just a quick disclaimer, Sagaklabs did send the steelbox to me for the purposes of making this video, but I don't have to say anything specific. All opinions are my own, and I don't have to send it back at the end. These extra buttons here on the side are for L3 and R3. The Capcom rules now state that you're allowed to have up to 11 action buttons, which means that you're allowed to have these regular 8 buttons here. You have 8, 9, 10 buttons to play with, and technically you could also map the touchpad button over here as well, and you also have the regular 5 buttons over here, which are your options menu. You've got the back button. This would normally be your touchpad if you were playing on console. And this is the home button, which would, again, only be useful if you're on console. And this button, believe it or not, this is a dedicated button for turbo mode. And I'm going to demonstrate to you one of the coolest things about the turbo button. If I press this button and then I press these buttons here, you can actually see an on-screen display which labels which buttons have been mapped to turbo with a double circle. One of the main things that makes turbo features kind of useless on a lot of other arcade controllers is that you don't really know what mode you're in. It's kind of scary, but with a little screen, you can always see which buttons are set to turbo. And that brings us on to another thing, which is a quality of life change, which is just generally having a screen in your controller. Now, if you're a musician and you've got a MIDI keyboard, a lot of them do now have screens built in. You can see the information is displayed here along the top. You can see I'm in X input mode, but if I were to remove the controller, hold down a different button, and then plug myself back in, it will reboot the controller and it'll be in, for example, PS4 mode. There's also Switch mode, and I believe there is also PC keyboard mode. So if you're playing emulators, the way you do this is by holding down the right trigger button, let the controller reboot itself, and as you can see, HID, Human Interface Device, keyboard mode. The next thing it says here is T15. It sounds kind of cryptic, but it's basically the speed at which turbo is activated. You can see that it's running at a rate of 15 times per second. I can actually set this to a different frequency, 2 punch inputs every second. Again, you may not usually use the turbo feature, but now that you have this level of customizability and visibility directly on the controller, you might actually start using it. The next thing along the top says DP, that's for D-pad, and it just means that your left, down, right, and your up buttons are going to give you standard D-pad input. To change these modes, you hold down a combination of buttons. In this case, it's 4 and 5 at the same time. Then you press left to go to left stick, or right to go to right stick. And that actually brings me to one feature that kind of annoys me on this controller, and it's the fact that it doesn't have enough options buttons. Although it has got 5 very nice, easy to press keys right here that do not hurt. I really love these buttons. There just aren't really enough of them. I really wish I had more buttons. Having to press multiple buttons at the same time means you open up the options menu when you're trying to do things like change this. And last but absolutely not least, a very important piece of information is the SOCD mode. If you're into fighting games, you'll know that you have to stay up to date with the latest rules for tournaments, and for Street Fighter in 2023, they've just changed the rules. If I press this key combination here, I can change it to SOCDU. In this case, left and right still leads to neutral, but down and up will now lead to up. Capcom has decided that if they're going to allow leverless controllers in competition, down plus up must equal neutral. Now, one question that is asked on this channel often is, does it have a last input priority mode? And I don't see one right now. It's possible that they could add that in firmware later. My only other option between up priority and neutral is to have no restriction. So if I press 2, 3, and right, it will go into SOCDX. No inputs are actually being cleaned by the controller. It just relies on the software itself to make decisions. I have no official information on this from Capcom, but this is probably because when people play online tournaments on a regular PC, if they're playing on an actual normal keyboard that doesn't have SOCD cleaning built in, they need to make sure that the inputs are cleaned correctly on the game side. Now, one more really cool feature about this controller, which is a surprise at this price point, is that you have a lot of customization when it comes to the colors of these buttons. So as you can see, I've got it set to blue right now, but by pressing this button here, you can actually change the different effects. So this one phases between all all of the different colors that are available. If I press another one, you've got an interesting animation. You've also got a rainbow selection of colors. You can just switch them off and then they activate only when you press them. You can also change the speed at which the animation goes. So if I press this button, it should slow down the animation, but if I press this button here, you can see that the animation goes wild. This is a little bit much for me, so I'm just going to switch this mode off and go back to having just a single color. But enough about the flashing lights. You want to know how this controller actually performs in the game and whether these extra buttons are useful. So let's have a look. When regularly playing fighting games, you're used to having all your directions over here and your action buttons over here, but these two extra buttons are useful because now you actually have a button that you can use with your left thumb. As you can see, normally your left thumb doesn't really get to do much. But if you're trying to react as quickly as humanly possible, you may find it easier to set your left thumb to something like drive impact. What normally happens in Street Fighter 6 is that sometimes the character will do a drive impact and you need to react, but normally you have to use a button over here. So for example, you would press both of your strong buttons at the same time, or you would use a shortcut that you've set. The thing is, if the shortcut that you've set is to one of these 8 buttons on the right, you have to use your right fingers, which may be busy doing something else, like getting ready to do a combo, or if you're double tapping buttons for various combos, or you're doing various button combinations. There's a number of reasons why these buttons, these fingers over here, might already be busy. But if you're over here and you've got your left thumb dedicated to drive impact, then you can be ready to react as soon as possible. So it's like, I see the drive impact, okay, I'm going to react. Now I can actually punish counter and then do whatever I want to do after that. So personally, I have my parry button set over here. It's just what I'm used to because I know how to use a regular leverless controller. But the truth is, if you've got your fingers resting here on the punch buttons, then you shift them down here to press the kick buttons, then you are not ready to press the parry button anymore. You can already see why it's so useful to have buttons down here for your thumbs. If you set the parry button down here to your left thumb, you'd always be ready to parry or to drive rush whenever you needed it. Or, in my case, since I'm very unlikely to be doing something like a jump at the same time as a parry, you could actually set it down to this button here. Personally, the way I've set it up is actually just to have parry up here on the right button, and I've actually set R3 to be Ken's 2 kicks at the same time, because when he's doing combos, he can go punch, punch, 2 kicks, and then it turns all of his moves into fire moves instead. I just find it really useful to be able to use my thumb as an extra appendage in this combo. But who knows, I might change my mind in the future and discover that it's better to have parry down here. That is the beauty of having the flexibility of having all of these extra buttons. And I'm just going to tell you right now, having tried this controller, it's going to be very, very difficult for me to go back to any of the other leverless controllers because I'll always feel like, oh, but I'm just missing this extra button. Now, I have seen some makers are inventing little add-ons that you can put on your controller so that you can add extra buttons to controllers without drilling holes in them. I think that's a fantastic idea, but this is already very cost effective. If you have a look at this, for $138, not including postage, it is a really nice controller for the price, considering all the features you get. Very few other controllers have a screen built in. Very few other controllers have really nice, smooth, easy to press buttons up here on the top. Very few other controllers have light up buttons, and very few other controllers also have these extra buttons because people are still kind of undecided as to where the optimal placement is for these 2 extra buttons. There is one caveat, however, and it's the fact that this controller does not work on PS5. It does work on PS4. I have tested it with a Brook Wingman FGC, and it works perfectly, so if you have that adapter, no problem. But if you're going to be playing mostly on PC anyway, this is a fantastic way to get in at a very low cost and have loads of extra features with very little compromise. But on that topic, let's talk about what the actual compromises are for a controller like this. This is not a big controller at all. Or I can almost hide the whole controller just behind the palm of my hand. That could be a good thing because it takes up no space in your bag whatsoever and takes up no space on your desk whatsoever. But when you are using it on your lap, it's just not really big enough. If I have my legs comfortably spread apart like this, you can see it's just not really long enough. A large number of other controllers are almost this small, but not quite this small. And I think this is a bit of a sacrifice. Easy to fix, of course, if you've got, like, I don't know, a tray that will cost you 50 cents, maybe $1, a piece of plastic that you could rest it on. That problem will be solved. But just in general, when you get it out of your bag and you just sit it down on your lap, you're going to be like, this is not really big enough. Now, it's not like it shifts around or anything. It's just that you have to sit with your legs together like this, and not everyone can sit like this comfortably for a large period of time. Generally speaking, I need to have my legs some distance apart. In terms of angle of my hands, really, it shouldn't hurt more, but I feel like it does feel a bit cramped. The buttons themselves are maybe 3 or 4 millimeters more closed in compared to the competition. It does not make such a difference that it should cause your wrists to hurt. My wrists don't hurt, but I do feel, maybe it's just psychological, when I'm holding this controller, I'm like, oh man, it's really small and I feel cramped. But actually, check out most of the other leverless controllers. The layout is really not much different to this. If you're okay with the size, the next thing you need to consider is the fact that it's a little bit heavier than most other controllers because it says steelbox. I guess this is steel, but it might be aluminum. I don't know exactly what the material is, but it is quite weighty. It feels like a good amount of quality, and also it won't shift around on your desk. A controller like this only has upward downward movement. There's no lateral movement anyway, so you don't need to worry about a controller like this shifting around too much. And if you're okay with the weight, the next thing you need to consider is the fact that because it's made of steel, you are more likely to damage other things in your bag. Most of the other controllers that I've tested are made of plastic and they have round edges. Well, this controller does have round edges, but it is still made of metal. And because of that hardness, just straight up hardness, this would 100% damage like your phone screen if you just threw it in your bag. The last thing I should probably point out is, as you can see, they have custom printed some art for me. I don't know if this is a service that they provide for all controllers, but I'm pretty sure there is a template so that you can print your own artwork. The way that it has been applied is actually, it's just a piece of paper. They printed out this artwork on a piece of paper for me, and they put it underneath this right here, which just screws down with regular screws. You just remove these screws right here and you can get the white surface of the controller, but there's also a black edition that you can choose. The reason I've chosen the artwork you see here is that I actually drew this in a live stream. It was like a few years ago when we were playing Grand Blue Fantasy Versus. The new version is coming out this week, and next year, so in about a month or so, Under Night In-Birth 2 is coming out, and this is one of the most important aspects of Under Night. It's a special gauge called the grind grid gauge, but hopefully this demonstrates kind of where you can fit some artwork. As you can see, now that we have a large number of extra buttons on this controller, the areas that you can actually place artwork is getting smaller and smaller. Eventually, we're going to get to a point where we're just using a keyboard, and then, of course, there would be no space for artwork whatsoever. But whether we should switch to just playing on computer keyboards, that's another discussion that we could potentially have another time. These are Kale low-profile switches, but they're hot swap, so you should be able to swap them out with your own. And if you have a look here at the buttons, I'll just zoom in, you can actually just pull them straight off. They look like Punk Workshop keycaps to me. Other controllers I've received with these buttons had a more textured feel to them. These ones are the smooth ones. On the ordering page for the Sagaklabs Steelbox, you can actually choose between other switches. So there are linear switches, there are clicky switches, and I believe there is a tactile option as well. But I really like that they've chosen this particular switch because, as you can see, it's got the plus shape stem, and that makes it compatible with these Punk Workshop buttons. This cable, as you can see, is not very long. I guess going with the theme of the Steelbox being a super tiny controller, they're expecting that most people are playing online, at home, at their desk. But this cable, I think this is only 1 meter long, or it might be 0.8 meters long, so this is a very short cable. But the discussion about having these extra buttons goes deeper and deeper the more that you think about it. Because, for example, if you're doing things like option selects in many games, sometimes if you press this combination of buttons, sometimes if you have to press them at a slight different timing, it can get kind of complicated. If you wanted to set a button down here to be, for example, A and D at the same time, then instead of going A, D, and then wiping over to the C button like 1 frame later or 2 frames later, you could change this to make it significantly easier by having A and D be set to this button, and then all you have to do is this. And it's going to be significantly easier to time that and get it right every single time, rather than trying to press 3 buttons like this. It's a fiendishly interesting area that controllers are entering into. Listen, that's all for the Steelbox from Sagaklabs. I think it's an excellent controller, and especially at this price point, usually you would expect to pay more than the competition to get extra features. But having these extra 2 buttons, a screen built in, a really nice set of easy to press keys over here, a huge number of of functions, especially the fact that the buttons light up. You have easy access to changing the turbo features, something that I wouldn't normally want to use just because it's a faff, but it makes it so easy on the steelbox to use the turbo features and to adjust them to exactly the right frequency that you require for whatever game that you're playing, just by holding down a button here, pressing a button here, and then you actually see the feedback on the screen. It's a very high-level controller, considering the price and the way that they've done it. Just making it a PC, PS4, Switch, PS3 controller, instead of spending extra money on putting a chip in here that will work for the PS5 as well. These unofficial controllers are very popular, and unless Sony pulls a special move on us and kills compatibility on all controllers that are unofficial, I think it's safe to say that going with a controller that isn't officially licensed is still a pretty safe option. Anyway, that's all I've got time for. Be sure to subscribe to the channel. Check out this video next if you're really interested in controllers and you want to see exactly what is out there before you choose one and spend your hard-earned cash. I've been NihongoGamer. I'll see you all real soon.